What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we got a bombshell dropped of a spoiler today. This is the release of the Annihilation Legion new Army of Renown for Warhammer 40,000 and Necron specifically. This one has been in the works for ages. It feels like rumors of a destroyer-focused Army of Renown have been circulating for years, and we finally have it in the most recent White Dwarf, and photos of it are now circulating the internet. So let's go through it and talk about all of the weird and zany mechanics available for this Necron Army of Renown. First off, this Army of Renown is a little bit complex. Some of them are more or less complex than others, but this one essentially overlays several sets of army abilities over top of the normal Necron army abilities. You can only include Destroyer Cult, Flayed One, and Plasmacyte units, so that cuts most of the vehicles and characters. You do still have access to things like Scorpic and Locust Destroyer Lords, as well as, obviously, all of the different types of Destroyers, so Scorpics, Ophidians, and Locusts, as well as Locust Heavy Destroyers, as well as Hexmarks and Flayed Ones, but you lose access to things like the Silent King, who is a big buff to Destroyers because of his wound rerolls, especially for Scorpics and Ophidians. All of your units lose the Command Protocols ability, but there is an exception to that we'll talk about later, and everything must be the same dynasty. Now, interestingly, the dynasty keyword is going to be relevant for this one because depending on the type of unit that you have, some of your units may or may not be benefiting from your dynastic codes. On top of that, you'll still unlock your dynasty stratagems for picking the correct dynasty, so trying to take a good dynasty alongside the Army of Renown is still going to be very important. Now, first off, the benefits are pretty self-explanatory. You get the correct keyword, and you can take their Warlord trait, relics, and stratagems as normal. In addition, if your Warlord is in a Vanguard detachment, you essentially get the detachment discount as you would a battalion or patrol, because basically all of your units are going to be elite slots. So you're going to be taking almost everything in a Vanguard, and the Vanguard's going to essentially act as a sort of a pseudo-battalion for you. Now, all of your Destroyer Cult units gain Cult of Annihilation as well as Annihilation Protocol. So this is a replacement for the normal command protocols that works a little bit differently, and that we'll talk about a little bit later. Your Flayed Ones are effectively your troops. They don't actually count as troops, but they do get objective secured if they are 10 or more models. And your Hexmark Destroyers both move to the HQ slot and are opened up for free if you have an equivalent destroyer in your army. Destroyer Lord, I should say. The HQ slot allows you to take smaller detachments from this Army of Renown and lead them with Hexmark Destroyers without having to pay for the larger Lords. But in addition, you can also take additional Hexmark Destroyers since it's a little bit tough to fit them into a Vanguard detachment if they're competing with Flayed Ones and Scorpic Destroyers, but also if you're taking multiple Destroyer Lords, and the Hexmark Destroyers are in your HQ slot, it would be tough to take. So the free battlefield roll is pretty good for them. I don't know if you take more than one in this list, but I can see them being pretty effective at just being a little bit of crowd clear in a list that is otherwise very adept at killing heavy armor. Now, the Cult of Annihilation ability, importantly, this is only relevant for your destroyer units. So your Flayed Ones and Plasmacytes are not affected by this rule. First off, Cult of Annihilation replaces your dynastic code, so that unit it still is dynasty keyworded, so it's still affected by your stratagems, but it's no longer affected by your subfaction ability. That means that, importantly, you can't take, for example, Obsec Dynasty, Relentlessly Expansionist Eternal Conquerors, the normal wombo combo that we see in Necrons being played right now. That will work on your Flayed Ones and your Plasmacytes, but all of your Destroyers will not be affected by that. In addition, those Destroyers get +1 to hit and +1 to wound if they target a unit that is below half strength. Now, I'm not sure how often this comes into play. It's a huge benefit. +1 to hit and +1 to wound is enormous, but mostly it's only going to be useful on larger enemy units. And those aren't seen in huge numbers in the meta right now. I'm thinking units of probably above 10 models. It will be useful in mirror matches where you're fighting opposing armies of heavy infantry, and may actually make this Destroyer Army of Renown good against opposing Necron armies that are taking themselves a lot of Destroyers and Scarab Swarms and things like that you're going to be able to knock below half strength with a Locust Destroyer unit, for example, and then go in with Ophidians and get your +1 to hit and wound and clear them out. Now, importantly, that also affects your ranged and melee attacks. It's every time you're selected to shoot or fight, which means if you have a Locust Destroyer or potentially a Locust Heavy Destroyer firing into a unit that's below half strength, then you're going to get +1 to hit and wound on their attacks as well. Now, importantly, that is going to be a little bit of a fixer for the lack of My Will Be Done in this army. I don't believe that any of the Destroyer characters have access to that, and obviously you don't have the Silent King, who's a big source of that +1 to hit in the normal Necron list, But getting +1 to hit and wound on a unit that is probably rerolling ones to hit for its own hardwire for destruction, and then getting the reroll ones to wound from the nearby destroyer lords is actually going to be pretty effective. So most of the infantry in the game, for example, you're going to be hitting and wounding on 2s with full rerolls, which is pretty strong, assuming that you have some units, some shooting units that can knock them below half strength in the earlier in your turn. Now we do have one Warlord trait available for this. It gives you Teslaing 6s in melee, which is fine, I guess, but unfortunately, I don't believe there's too much dice fixing on these lords, so that becomes a very powerful Warlord trait if you have full rerolls, for example. They do get their rerolls of 1, but that is usually all the rerolls they can source, and not any of the characters, so I don't know how useful this is. You're probably going to be wanting to save your command points to use some of the really cool stratagems that are available for this Army of Renown, or you're going to be using one of the core Necron Warlord traits. I think Enduring Will for -1 damage or the Eternal Madness for full wound rerolls are both going to be pretty useful. The relics are pretty interesting, if a little sort of banal. The Chariot of the Hierarchs makes a Locust Lord trans hitman, so it can only be hit on 3s, and it piles in and consolidates an additional 3 inches. It would be pretty useful if you could get the benefit of the Objective Secure Dynasty trait so that you could run and steal objectives with that guy. Otherwise, I mean, it makes him particularly difficult to kill, and if you stack that with the -1 damage Warlord trait, he actually becomes very tanky, which is kind of sweet, but the Locust Lords are a little bit awkward to begin with. For the Scoreback Lord, we have the Night Cult Scythe, which is exactly just a Hyperphase Harvester, but it loses the -1 to hit and instead gets the splash damage ability that we see on flails out of Death Guard, so access damage continues to be allocated to a unit, as if you were playing Age of Sigmar. That one's actually pretty good. Getting that 3 damage weapon without the -1 to hit is a pretty big deal for that guy. The fact that his weapon has a built-in -1 to hit, but doesn't hit particularly harder than like a regular Thunderhammer, is a little bit funky. Last but certainly not least, we have the Hexmark Destroyer, which allows it to replace all of its pistol shots with a single D3 plus 3 damage strength 9 shot. I think this one's actually pretty good, just because Hexmark Destroyers have very little to do against heavy armor, and having a lookout serrable shooting platform that can fire the equivalent of like a laser destroyer is pretty solid. I wish it was 18-inch range instead of 12, because it does put that guy in kind of an awkward spot, but if you're going to charge him, he has a Hexmark Destroyer, so unless you're charging him with heavy infantry, he has a pretty good chance of killing some people on the way in. Interestingly, this also has the beam rule that we've seen in other factions, similar to the Leagues of Votann beam, where it shoots everything in a line between the attacker and the target. And given that it is a Hexmark Destroyer, so it's hitting everything on 2s and rerolling 1s is going to be pretty effective, and the number of times you're going to hit with this thing is pretty good. A lot of times you see that on characters and they don't have any hit roll manipulation, and you get one shot with it and you flub it and you're really sad, but the Hexmark Destroyer is one of the most consistent ranged attackers in the game, so I think putting a big laser cannon on him is pretty cool.
I'm a firing my laser!
Now we have Annihilation Protocol. So this ability essentially replaces your normal command protocols, but again, only works for Scorpex. So to break down the different stats here that everyone gets applied to, your Flayed Ones and Plasmacytes get no protocols but your dynastic codes. The Destroyers get no dynastic codes but get these protocols, and get the sort of weird Cult of Annihilation ability to get +1 to hit and wound against the low strength units. So your Flayed Ones and your Scorpex are basically two separate sub-factions in this Army of Renown, because they are affected by totally different faction abilities. Now, these don't work exactly like command protocols, at least post data slate, because the command protocols get that one protocol that you would normally pick at the start of the game to apply for the entirety of the game. This one instead applies one protocol for each battle round, full stop. It's just like the on release command protocol abilities. Now, these command protocols are pretty effective. Protocol of the Swift Murder either gives you light cover if you moved that turn, which I imagine most of the army is going to be doing, since there's very little reason to remain stationary with this army, or everybody can perform heroic interventions, good both against shooting units, shooting enemies, and melee-focused enemies, so you can use those defensive interventions. Protocol of the Killing Surge, either it gives you fallback and charge or +2 movement. Protocol of the Dread Strike gives you Gene Rot Might, so 6s to hit, automatically wound, or gives you +1 to wound with ranged attacks. Protocol of the Undying Gaze ignores cover. That's actually very good for Locust Destroyers, for example, shooting into units with Armor of Contempt, since you will punch them down to a 4+ save even if they're in cover, which is pretty solid. Or you can perform actions and still make ranged attacks with ranged weapons. Protocol of Perfect Destruction gives you +1 to charge, or gives you an additional 3 inches on your pile-in and consolidation. And last but certainly not least, Protocol of the Immortal Warrior gives you +1 toughness, very good in certain situations, or +1 to your saving characteristic, not invulnerable saves. All of these protocols are actually really powerful, and these are the kind of abilities that I like to see out of Armies of Renown. They're replacing your standard faction abilities, but with something very unique and very impactful. Getting things like +2 movement or +1 save on your whole army turn to turn is a really big deal. And I think, skillful use of these protocols is going to be super impactful, just like we've seen with existing Necrons. The downside here is that I don't think we have too much manipulation of these command protocols like we would normally have in a normal Necron army. Obviously, they aren't actually command protocols, so effects that impact them, like the Saracen Warlord trait, does not apply, because these are Annihilation protocols, not command protocols. So as far as I can tell, there's no way to actually switch them if you need a particular one. So they are going to be a little bit slower and less efficient than normal command protocols. But obviously, the effect is a little bit stronger. Now let's talk about stratagems. And this is where I think the real power of this Army of Renown come out to play. First off, Swift Dismemberment gives you advance and charge for any Destroyer Cult unit for 1 CP, which is super strong. We're going to be lacking a lot of that Relentless March plus Sudden Storm that we normally are expecting to have from Scorpic Destroyers. We do have the directive for +2 movement off of Protocol of the Killing Surge, so it's not like they don't have any movement buffs, but they're going to be a little bit less consistent fast movement than they would normally be. And to be fair, only a 10-ish inch movement for a dedicated melee unit that doesn't do anything in range is actually kind of low when we consider most of the melee threats in the game. So being able to move 10 inches and advance and charge actually gives them a pretty decent threat range. Hyperphase Impalement is usable on Ophidian Destroyers and lets them ignore abilities that ignore wounds, so that ignores phase caps and damage ignore rolls, so things like Feel No Pain. For an army that basically only operates in like 1.5 phases with a little bit of a shooting phase and most of its stuff being dealt in melee, this is actually going to be really important to kill units like Abaddon or enemy Catan Shards, and I think the army would have trouble with those units unless it had this stratagem. The downside is that it is on Ophidian Destroyers, who are not the hardest hitting units, but they have a high volume of attacks, so especially things like those aforementioned Catan Shards are probably going to go down to an Ophidian unit being using this. Efficient Disintegration gets +1 damage on Locust Destroyers or Heavy Destroyers for 2 CP. To be fair, this is only Gauss Cannons and Gauss Destructors, does not work on your Enmitic Annihilators, which is a little sad. I'd like to see those big 3d 3 damage blast weapons increase to 2 damage, but it's only going to use for the anti-tank weapons. The weirdness here is that this kind of anti-synergizes with Extermination Protocols, the stratagem that you're already going to be using on those guys. Because the Gauss Cannons are only Strength 6, you basically always need wound rerolls to efficiently convert them, and if you're using both stratagems together, that's 4 CP, which in Warzone Nephilim is a lot. And I don't know how often you're going to have that much to spend. To be fair, there's not a lot of pregame selection for this army, and maybe spend 1 or 2 pregames, so you probably have a decent brace of CP to spend, but you also don't have Silent King to refund your CP, so I don't know how often you're going to actually be using this over the wound rerolls for that same unit. I wish that maybe it was 1 CP? I don't know. I'm not sure. Lurking Murderers is usable for flayed ones and gives them full rerolls as long as they're wholly within an area terrain feature. Pretty impactful depending on the terrain format that you're playing in. If you're playing US open terrain with the big bricks of area terrain, then this is actually a super strong ability. And lets your flayed ones run onto enemy objectives or pop out of Deep Strike and absolutely destroy whatever's on there. If you're playing a format that doesn't have that many area terrain features, it's actually going to be significantly less useful. But an important thing to note is that this is used at the start of the fight phase, which means that you can use it then, and then when you activate the flayed ones, use your pile-in and consolidate moves to move off of the terrain. The requirement to get +1 to wound doesn't require that you remain in the terrain feature, only that you are in the terrain feature when you're targeted by the stratagem. Moving on, Murderous Demise allows you to fight on death with a character model. This one's pretty okay. It means you're not resurrection protocoling them, but that might be just fine. Canoptech Reinforcement allows you to reset a Plasma Sight once per game for 1 CP. This is actually a pretty good one if you are taking one of the dynasties that gives you objective secured. Since the Plasma Sights aren't Destroyer Cult keyworded, so they don't get the Cult of Annihilation ability, which removes their dynastic code, they're actually still going to retain objective secured. And being able to drop an objective secured model for 1 CP within 3 inches of any of your units and outside engagement range of enemies is a pretty big deal. So there are going to be some situations where you actually purposefully kill one of your own plasma sites by running it out of its tether range of a destroyer cult unit from your army on an early game and then bring it back later. There's no requirement that the unit is originally destroyed by enemies, so you can just kill it yourself and then reanimate it, which is pretty cute. Weaponized bodies is an impact attack style stratagem. You roll a d6 for a destroyer cult unit when it impacts an enemy with a charge move. On a 5+, they deal 1 mortal wound up to a maximum of 6. Unfortunately, destroyer cult units are basically capped at 6-ish models. You can get a few more if you're taking heavy destroyers in a locust destroyer unit, and so for 2 CP, this probably deals like 2 mortal wounds. It also only hits 1 enemy unit and only rolls for the number of destroyer cult models in that unit that are in engagement range, so it's probably less than 2 mortal wounds pretty often. It's good if you need to deal 1 or 2 mortal wounds to something, maybe to phase cap it, but if you don't, this is not a very good stratagem. This should be 1 CP for sure. Moments of Clarity in your command phase gives any Annihilation unit from your army objective secured for 2 CP. These stratagems are always good, and the fact that it's any Annihilation Legion unit means it's usable on things like characters and plasmacytes, and that's actually amazing. One of Necron's most powerful abilities currently is the fact that their entire army can yoink objectives from people, and while the Annihilation Legion doesn't do that quite as efficiently as a normal Necron army does, the fact that it still has that opportunity is very good. And that's it. That's the entirety of the Annihilation Legion Army of Renown. 4 Necrons coming out of the most recent White Dwarf. I really actually kind of like this Army of Renown because, while I don't feel that it is more powerful than the classic Necron build, Necrons currently are extremely powerful because of their full army OPSEC ability. And you're focusing on destroyers but lacking a lot of the support for them, so they go from being relatively efficient to being sort of mediocre, I think. While they will get their bonuses to hit and occasional rerolls and things like that, especially from their characters, lacking the Silent King to really turn them into the powerhouses that they are in the normal Necron list is going to feel pretty bad if you're used to playing them alongside him. That said, I do think that it gives the army sort of an interesting and competitively viable, if not top-tier, way to play them, and I feel like that's really where armies of Renown want to land. I don't think I'm particularly more scared of this Army of Renown than I am the standard objective-secured Necron list, but that said, I do think that it definitely will put up a fight and be a lot more interesting than just playing against hordes of Scarab Swarms and the normal Scorpic Destroyers with the Silent King that we typically see. Anyway, that's it for this review of the Necron Army of Renown. Thanks everyone for watching. Glad I was able to get this video out. I was streaming this morning and I have stuff to do this evening, so I was a little bit worried that I wasn't going to be able to do it the day that this army list was released, but we're getting there. Thanks everyone for watching to the end of the video. Thanks everyone who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.